Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Citizens Crime Watch podcast. We hope everyone had a happy and safe holiday season. I'm thankful to be back here to host again. My name is Joe Bermudez, and with us today we have Caridad Mas-Batchelor from Miami-Dade Police Department. She is a special projects administrator with the department, and she does some really special stuff for the department. So welcome, Caridad.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to engage in this conversation that I hope will be super beneficial for your listeners.
Awesome. I know that you have some great info, and I think our listeners and our watchers will get a lot out of it. So can you tell us a little bit, what actually do you do? What does a special projects administrator do with Miami-Dade Police Department?
I get that question a lot. A special projects administrator really in our department has different roles, but I'm fortunate enough to really focus my work on the anti-trafficking kind of movement throughout our county. Within this role, I serve as the task force coordinator for the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, which is one of the first federally funded task forces and came into existence in the early 2000s. And Miami-Dade Police Department has served as the lead law enforcement agency for that task force since its inception. And so within that role, I serve as a liaison between law enforcement and the community, because the purpose of our task force is to really bridge that gap between law enforcement and the community, and really executing a comprehensive approach in combating human trafficking. As we'll dive into it, it's a very complex victimization and crime that takes place within our communities and nationwide, and our department has really taken a lead in combating that. And so we're really excited to have this conversation about it.
Wow, that sounds like a lot of work, a lot of official stuff, a lot of technical stuff. And you sound like probably a very busy person, so we're thankful to have you here.
Thank you.
So you mentioned a term there that why we're here today to talk to our listeners about and our viewers, human trafficking. Now, what actually is human trafficking? Because, the average person, you think, oh, human trafficking, is what we see in the movies. It's a container full of people being smuggled in across the border or something, and that's human trafficking. Is that what we're talking about when we talk human trafficking?
So in part, I will break down some pieces there, because I think you've said a lot of good words here that I think it'd be good for our listeners to dive into a little bit. So to define human trafficking, there is this very long technical legal definition that if anyone is that legal person and wants to read the definition, they can find it under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of the early 2000s. But for the regular person like myself and you that just is starting to understand human trafficking and trying to get a grasp as to what it really is breaks down in the following way. It's the use of force, fraud, or coercion to really force someone to either engage in sexual activities, what they call commercial sexual exploitation. So engaging in sexual activities for something of value, anything of value, not just money as we would think of, but maybe housing or clothing or food. That all has a monetary value. And then we have the labor component that doesn't often get too much attention because media, as you were referencing, really highlights sex trafficking. There's some sense of attention pool to that specific type of trafficking, mainly because people connect the exploitation specifically with children. And so, of course, we naturally gravitate to that piece of protecting our children.
Okay.
But labor trafficking does occur in our community. We do have the agricultural work, in the southern, South Miami-Dade area, in Homestead and different areas of our community, and it's taking place. So that's the definition. So force, what does that look like? As you think of physically making someone do something against their will. And that could really look very differently depending on the different cases. Force, we talked about. Fraud. We see that a lot where you're promised one thing, but when you get there, it's another. We see that, for example, someone is promised an employment opportunity. If you come work with us, we're going to pay you a certain amount of money for a certain amount of hours, and that's the agreement. But when the person arrives, they realize they now are working more hours. They are perhaps not getting paid. They're in perhaps bad conditions where they're working with perhaps materials that are hazardous or in environments that are not up to standard that we would think of when working. And so there's that fraud component. You were told one thing and you showed up and it was a completely other thing. And then coercion is difficult sometimes for us to understand when we're looking at cases, because coercion is somewhat of an internal thing. Your coercion and my coercion would look very differently.
It's what you feel.
It's what you feel.
How you feel being coerced.
And
okay,
so,
I can see that.
So if someone threatens me to hurt my children, I currently don't have children. So that pool doesn't trigger anything but you.
But that's a trigger point for me. My two kids are my world. So
for you,
for sure, 100%.
If there's the trafficker telling you, if you don't do this, I'm going to hurt your children.
Very good.
That's it.
I can see that.
So that's where we talk about somewhat defining it. And then you mentioned smuggling, if you'll let me just dive into that.
Yeah, go ahead.
The community really interchanged the word smuggling and human trafficking. And really, I think it's because of the media or the means of where they're seeing the cases stem from. But smuggling is a crime against a border, and human trafficking is a crime against a human. And so I think that's important. So a person can cross a border illegally, right? They could be smuggled into a country and not be a victim of human trafficking, because we don't have force, fraud, or coercion. They may have willingly chose to pay someone to smuggle them into the United States, as an example. But someone that is smuggled could end up in a trafficking situation, where they're exploited perhaps by the smuggler once they arrive to the United States and say, well, I got you here, but actually you owe me $20,000 more. Okay. And until you work that off.
So now that smuggling's transitioned into human trafficking.
Yes.
So, but that's very interesting that you bring that up, because in listening to you, what I get out of that too is it's, like you said, Hollywood and the media has made it into this whole smuggling really is, or human trafficking is smuggling, but human trafficking doesn't have to be that smuggling. It could be something domestic. There could be a lot of human trafficking going on here with U.S. citizens.
Oh, for
people
sure.
that are victims of this,
I think a misconception.
Forced prostitution or something like that could be considered a form of human trafficking.
Correct.
if I'm getting it right here. But so it's not just that idea of someone being brought from outside the U.S., but it's happening within our own borders.
Yeah, and I think a key thing is for the listeners to really catch on to is that there's no requirement of transportation for human trafficking to occur. We've seen cases where a victim of human trafficking stayed in one location and was repeatedly exploited in that one location. There was no movement. But when we think of movies and media, as we've been talking about, there's always this transport from one place to another, and they come into the United States. And so unfortunately...
glorified in that sense. And, and it doesn't have to be that. I've even heard of familiar human trafficking where, they're between family members, within a household could be happening. Right?
Yep. And that's one that people don't think of often. I think our community, or as a general member of the community, you would never think that your family member would traffic you. And so it's hard for us to understand why someone else's family dynamic accepts that behavior and traffics within their family. But when we look into it, what's the need? What is occurring within that family? It's not justifying it, but when you have addiction or mental health issues, or
there's a lot of outside factors that come into play.
They always do.
Right.
And so that's the nuances of those cases.
So with all this human trafficking or these issues now that are going on, how is it affecting us? Let's start big, nationally. How does it affect us nationally within as a country? How are we being affected?
Yeah, so human trafficking takes place anywhere. And everywhere. And it's not to be broad and not concrete in my response, but I think it's important for everyone to understand that it can occur in any state. And we've seen that. So through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is the hub to really be able to pull statistics and data based on the calls they receive, you see that there are statistics and information across the United States. So it's occurring. Now, how it looks like, what the trafficking that is occurring in those states and those communities may vary. If you're in a more agricultural, labor trafficking prone community, you may see that more than sex trafficking.
Okay.
Miami, for example, or the state of Florida, we have a mixture. We have areas of our state in again, as I mentioned earlier, the southern points up to the northern points of Florida. There's a lot of agriculture that takes place in our state, but we also have that tourist industry and that nightlife industry that perhaps alludes for potential exploitation of sex trafficking.
There you go.
So we are seeing it across the board. And I think that understanding that it can happen anywhere While I said earlier that transportation is not required for human trafficking, we do see that traffickers do transport victims across state lines or even county lines. And that's why it's so important through efforts like our task force that covers from Monroe County to Broward County. It allows us to ensure that if movement is occurring of a victim between those county lines, we have a system in place to be able to support them.
Awesome.
And we'll dive into that.
Now, nationally, how are the statistics? Are we seeing it going up? Are we seeing it going down?
So it varies. It's a crime that's ongoing, and it's an underground crime for the most part. So one of the challenges with human trafficking is that we don't have a set way of collecting statistics. Okay. Similar to, let's say, domestic violence in the early years of us really taking it on, right? Everyone was figuring out how to track it, how to manage it, how to provide services. And so, as I mentioned, the law passed in the early 2000s. Yes, human trafficking was obviously happening in our community before then, but until we put the law in place, we weren't really able to take proactive approaches. Okay. So we quite haven't figured out how to really gather statistics, but every agency, so our department collects statistics, every agency for victim services collects their own statistics, but what we don't have is just one hub spot where we can really see nationally what's going on, excluding the National Human Trafficking Hotline, as I mentioned, but that's only based on the calls they receive. So if they don't get the call, they can't track that stat.
True. So, it's a lot like crime prevention. Like when I talk, awareness and stuff like that, is what has effect. But yeah, it's hard, something hard to track. But
and
what we can do is try to do our best to impact it somewhat.
Yeah.
So nationally, so let's wrangle it in a little bit, and let's talk about here in Dade County, Miami-Dade County. What are you guys doing, or what do you see when it comes to human trafficking? What issues we have, and what do you see that you're combating the most here in Miami-Dade County?
So Miami-Dade County in the state of Florida is the top 3 county for concentration of human trafficking.
Wow.
For a lot of the stuff that we touched on a little bit, right?
Top 3?
Top 3.
Ooh.
But if you think about Miami-Dade County, we have the Miami International Airport. We have the Port of Miami. We have a lot of transport in and out of our county. We host major events. We have a lot of, again, tourism and nightlife. So it's really a community that
got a lot of movement. You got a lot in and out, and I can see that. All right.
And so that's why we rank so high. And this is not one of those things we want to rank so high in.
But this is something we don't want to be number 1 in, right?
Right.
We want to be down at the bottom of that list.
But we take on the challenge of being number 1. And so the department, as I mentioned, really takes it head on, not only as a leader of the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force, but also through efforts like the educational campaign that was launched in early of January of 2020, or last year, 2021. And so that educational campaign was intentional in understanding that we're a top county in the state, and how do we make sure that we let our residents know what's happening, and we did that through efforts of awareness and education. It's really the basis of where we can start, and this is what this podcast is. Let's get the conversation started, and even if you don't understand it, because it can be complex, we at the Miami-Dade Police Department do not expect residents to be able to define it and understand it and certify that what they're seeing is human trafficking. That's not their responsibility. We leave that to the detectives and those investigating these cases to make that final decision. But what we hope through awareness and education is that we stir the conversation, and if you see something, say something, right, that falls in your gut and it tells you this doesn't seem right, at least report it and let those that, have the expertise to investigate the cases determine whether or not it's human trafficking.
And that's what a lot of crime prevention is. Mm-hmm. A lot of CCW, Citizens Crime Watch, is being that eyes and ears, so that extra eyes and ears out there. So it's something that we want. Yep. People out there to be able to see something, and if it, like you said, that I love that, because I use that all the time when I teach. I tell people, hey, if there's something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't. There's a good chance. I mean, you may be overreacting a little bit, but you're better off reporting it and letting somebody know, and for us to make sure that it's nothing. Correct. Then later on you're like, oh my God, I had a feeling about that, so that's awesome. Well, it's very important, and that's one of the things we appreciate you coming out here today and to talk to us. So thank you. So we talk about here while we're here. We're here about awareness and kind of educating the community to be those eyes and ears. Mm-hmm. Tell me something. Again, I keep going back to this. You're not going to see the containers of people driving down the Palmetto Expressway, right? And say, "Oh, that's human trafficking." Mm-hmm. But what do we look for? What is the average person who's not a law enforcement trained individual? What are signs that they can look for that may give you that fuzzy feeling to say, you know what, that's not right. Something's going on there. That might be human trafficking.
Right, and I think that's the key part, might be, right? So it depends. If you're in your community and let's say you're seeing high traffic in and out of one particular home with diverse people coming in, or young men or women, because, we didn't touch on this before, but anyone could be a victim of human trafficking. So I think most of the time we're looking for young women that may be in vulnerable situations, but men who fall, unfortunately, in this victimization as a marginalized community, because we don't really see too many of those cases reported. But if you're seeing high traffic coming in and out of a home, if you're seeing other illicit behaviors occurring within a community, we usually see some types of nexus with other criminal activities. So if there's drug sales and other types of exploitation taking place, or if you're in your community and you had mentioned forced prostitution, where you're seeing a lot of prostitution taking place in your community, then again, it doesn't automatically mean that it is human trafficking. We do have to look at all of the elements associated that we talked about earlier, but those are potential red flags, something to look into.
And who better? And who better to know about this in the community? Because as a police officer, you can drive through and, okay, you see a house with a lot of cars? Maybe they're having a party. Mm-hmm. But if you're the neighbor and this is happening every single day, and, there's in and out at all times, all hours of the day, that's a red flag for a neighbor. And that's something for them to report and get out, right? Yeah,
and again, to that point, if you're in your community, and this was a case that happened years ago where there was a victim from Haiti that was brought from Haiti. She was a young child brought over with the purpose of being exploited as a domestic servant within a home. Okay. Which is also a form of labor trafficking that we don't talk about. And the neighborhood, after the case came out, right, and it was public information, and the person was found responsible for that type of exploitation, neighbors were like, well, I did see, that she would take showers outside with a water hose, but didn't think anything of it. Or I did see, other activities where maybe the child wasn't playing outside or coming outside of the home at any point, except for when doing some laborious work.
It's right? That Monday morning quarterback afterwards. That was a little strange, but they didn't say anything. And I can see we get a lot of that when it comes to all different types of crimes, but this is something very serious when we're talking about here when human trafficking.
The bystander effect, right? We all think someone else is going to report it. We all think someone else is going to take action. And unfortunately, the time passes and no one does. And then it's brought to our attention through other forms. And then it ends up being, unfortunately, a case larger than anyone anticipated it to be. So that's it within your communities. But then, another very vulnerable population that we should talk about is our children. So children are vulnerable for a lot of reasons beyond just being children, but they're also influenced by a lot of different things. Social media right now really plays a role in their lives. Most youth have their phones attached to their hip far more than parents would like.
Everybody wants to be an influencer. That's like me. I'm going to be an influencer.
Everybody has social media platforms, and we all know that not often what you see on those social media platforms is reality. And so knowing what pulls at our youth, traffickers see this as a business. They're marketing. They're picking up. They're trying to figure out how to get...
And it's free marketing for them.
Free marketing.
It's all free.
And so, our youth are very vulnerable in these social media platforms. And I always say this, I preface this. It's not to tell your children they can't be on social media. And the point of this conversation is not to instill fear, because fear doesn't really solve anything. Let's educate. Let's have conversations. Right. So what we've seen are traffickers that may put up these fake pages to engage with, let's say, a minor and really start chatting with them through their direct messaging, start to show them the life that they have. They see the pictures. It's enticing. The youth may want to participate in the party or in whatever is taking place that they're seeing on social media. They start to build a rapport, which is also known as grooming.
Grooming. I was going to say, these guys are professional groomers. It's like just like a sexual predator would be online. They take the time, and it doesn't happen overnight.
Nope.
But they are professional groomers. They know exactly what to say, when to say it, how to say it to get their attention.
And they learn what they need to learn. So what's taking place at home? What's your relationship with your parents?
Exactly.
You know, kids, at one point, every kid hates their parents. They don't understand me. And so there goes the trafficker.
There you go.
Stepping in. I understand you. Your parents don't love you. If they loved you, then, you know, they didn't let you go.
Lack of affection, all the stuff we talk about when we talk about groomers, just the lack of a parental figure, maybe. Yep. So just stepping in there and taking that place.
And the reality of it is that a lot of residents of our county may work 1 or 2 jobs and are, you know, trying to take care of their families. And while they're good parents, don't have the time to be on top of their children 24/7 and know exactly what's happening at all times. But that's why conversations about this type of exploitation is important. So if someone does approach your child on social media and tries to sell them the dream, it's important to let them know that if it sounds too good to be true, it most likely
usually is. Right.
And for them to let them know, hey, this person I don't know sent me a message on social media and I don't know who they are and this is what they're telling me. Engage, create that sense of confidence within your family dynamics. So social media is a big one. But then our schools are also a place that I don't think most people are thinking of. But traffickers really remove themselves from that direct recruitment sometimes and will utilize other youth that they've exploited into this victimization to recruit other children in schools. And so you always hear the examples of like a child with a new phone that wasn't purchased by their parents or new clothes or their hair done. But sometimes the lack of their attendance in school is a red flag. Do you have a youth that's missing a lot of school? Are we checking in? Are we doing welfare checks? Are we checking in with the family to just see what's going on? Do the parents know that they're not attending school? We've heard cases where the parent drops off the kid every day and had no idea that after the drop off, the kid was going somewhere else.
Going the other way. Wow.
And so that vulnerability, right, of the youth within our schools, and our schools do an amazing job. Miami-Dade County Public Schools are doing work alongside us and are members of our task force, and we're trying to make sure that we get that awareness and the training within the schools. So that they know what to look for, but also they can create a system in place to respond if they find that someone is being, exploited. And so it can get challenging, but the point is, yes, anyone could be a victim of human trafficking. Vulnerabilities attached to a child really have to do with their age and their interest to want to be a part of something, their interest to be loved if there's a family dynamic that doesn't allow for various reasons to receive that attention that they need. And it's important for families that may be listening to know that a trafficker will take advantage of that and exploit that information to try to get your child to, engage with them further. And cases we've seen is that they'll send, messages with photos that are later, used against them by the trafficker as a means of control.
Yeah,
so we talk about coercion. It
starts off with something, and there you go to your coercion, and it's a little bit of blackmailing going on, and
I'm going to tell your parents.
Exactly. Like when we talk about internet safety, a lot of times you may send a little image or you send a little statement and you think it's nothing. And then it turns into, well, you aren't supposed to be doing this. And if you don't do what I tell you, then I'm going to tell your parents. And now, our kids don't know any better. And it's the end of the world if they take away my iPhone, So I'm going to do what you're going to tell me to do. So, it's like I said, these guys are professional groomers and they're very good. So that's awesome because I know we do have a lot of teachers that listen and some students that listen involved in our Youth Crime Watch. So it's great for them to have this information because I've heard of that's a big problem in this, at least when it comes to the youth, how they use other kids for their recruiting tools. So maybe for our teachers out there, when you see that one child all of a sudden that has that brand new purse, those new shoes, those new devices and stuff like that, and they're starting to wrangle in other girls and boys, that it may be a little bit of a red flag for a little bit of involvement. Yeah,
what I tell everyone is take every chance as an opportunity to engage in conversation. If you see something's off or you want to inquire about that new phone, just have a conversation with the student.
You can do your little subliminal investigations there. It's easy to do.
Sometimes when you could just start that conversation, you get way more information than you think.
Than direct questioning there.
Yeah, like, hey, it's a new phone. When did you get that new phone? And, engaging as to, did your parents buy you the phone?
Yeah, very good.
And kids oftentimes don't realize, they don't always know how to lie. Naturally, if you get them in a conversation, the truth comes out. And so I always tell people when we talk about human trafficking, the details of whether or not it is, as we define it federally, is complex. But to determine whether or not this is or isn't something to report, just ask the questions, engage in conversation. Teachers with the students, and just say,
sometimes they may be saying things that they don't consider as human trafficking, and you're like you said, you get that gut feeling that doesn't feel right, and that person may need some help.
My boyfriend is 27 years old.
Yeah,
my 27-year-old boyfriend bought me my phone.
There you go. And he wants me to bring my friends next time we go to the party. Little flags there. So
exactly.
Oh my gosh. So we talked about some signs. Let me ask you this. Now we've come up with some of these identifications that that people can work, or some clues that may lead them to it. What if you do come across someone who's a victim? What kind of resources do we have for them here in Miami-Dade County? What services do they have that we can try to help them with?
There's a plethora of services. Again, being a top in this category really has allowed our county to put together a lot of resources. I will say that the first thing is, if you do find out that someone comes to you and identifies themselves as a victim of human trafficking, your personal safety is important. At no point do we advocate for anyone to go into a situation and rescue a person that may be in a trafficking situation. That's where we, again, encourage you to call law enforcement and let the experts, right, the law enforcement, the trained individuals to go in and handle that. And we always like to say that because sometimes in our interest of being good people, we want to go and help someone that may be in a vulnerable situation. But we always have to take a step back and make sure that we don't put ourselves in a situation that
you're making one situation, a bad situation, worse.
It could. So I do like to preface that in regards to the resources. So once that person is identified as a victim of human trafficking, as I mentioned, we do have a lot of services. We do receive a lot of federal funds in this county, specifically to human trafficking, through the Office for Victims of Crime that specializes in providing funding for human trafficking services and investigations. And so aside from our task force, as I mentioned earlier, who receives funds, there are a lot of organizations, the Christie House that most people know of, Citrus Family Health also receives services for the services of human trafficking. The International Rescue Committee is our key partner, for example, for the South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force. They provide victim services. They've been doing that in our community since 2003. And the great thing about it is they provide services to all victims. And I'll dive into that. When I say all victims, I mean men, women, children, members of the LGBTQI community, domestic victims, so those that may be born here in our county or in the United States, but also foreign nationals. So that's a category that I think people don't always talk about.
That's a big fear. I mean, and we have to, the reality of it, Miami-Dade County has probably a large population because of, you said, of, the areas of farming and stuff like that. You have a lot of non-citizens. So
correct. There's
a fear, and you have to deal with that, maybe the lifestyle they were brought up in a different country. Correct. When it comes to dealing with law enforcement. We talk about that when we talk about crime prevention and law enforcement in multicultural communities. You have a lot of these nations that are not too privy to working with law enforcement.
Correct.
And there's more of a fear of law enforcement than not being helpful. So
correct.
That's something that probably a big obstacle you guys have when it comes to that.
Yeah, so the great thing about the International Rescue Committee providing these services is that the status of an individual doesn't matter, right? If they're a victim of human trafficking, then they can provide services to them. And those services really are comprehensive. We're looking at medical, mental health, housing support, financial support. We're also looking at some of those unique needs that each person may have. So in the case of a foreign national, connecting them with an immigration attorney, connecting them with the services that they may need to be able to do that. But yes, it's a real challenge when we're talking about working with foreign nationals because there's a fear of deportation. And you alluded to it. If their country has a negative conception or relationship with law enforcement, they bring that with them, and they don't know to trust our law enforcement. And traffickers use that as a means. I was going to
say there's that coercion, right?
Yep.
That threat. That's one of the biggest things. Hey, don't tell anybody or you're going to get deported. So.
Yeah, and that's a huge way of controlling that particular population. And what would be great for us to just clear up in this podcast is that if a person with non-status or foreign national is a victim of human trafficking, if the trafficking occurred here within the United States through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, they are eligible to receive services as the ones I mentioned through the International Rescue Committee and other agencies throughout the nation. If maybe you have listeners that are outside of this county, it's across the nation. There are service providers like this. But here locally, they also have the ability to apply for what's called a T visa, a trafficking visa. And, you know, those are very hard to come to get, but you have the ability to apply for it. And luckily for us, through our task force, we have Homeland Security Investigations and the Federal Bureau of Investigations as members of our task force, as board members. And so we're able to tap into those relationships, and they are victim-centered, trauma-informed, and understand the unique kind of realities that a non-citizen or foreign national may experience. And so we'll support them along the way of applying for that T visa and grant them eventually status in the United States.
Wow, that's awesome.
As a victim of human trafficking.
That's an amazing service. And hopefully it will help those individuals that have that fear to come forward and look for these services and look for this help and seek out some of these resources. So it's awesome. Very good. I think you talked about there's a recent resolution that was passed here in Miami-Dade County?
Yes, so that was the educational campaign that the department executed in January of 2021. And that was a great effort from the department, passed, through to ensure that we put together education and awareness in English, Spanish, and Creole, understanding that those are the primary languages that we have in our county.
Right.
And creating material that was representative for sex trafficking and labor trafficking and inclusive for all Miami-Dade County residents. So we put out printed materials through posters in the county buildings. We held press release. We had a lot of interviews in English, Spanish, and in Creole about human trafficking and really targeting, providing that awareness really for prevention. I think in your previous podcast, you talked about, preventing versus kind of coming in on the back end and trying to be the ones to say, unfortunately, this situation has happened. Yeah,
I love saying that. That's one of my things. Is I would rather spend my time teaching you not to be a victim than have to spend my time helping you because you were a victim.
Exactly.
So to me, that's one of the most important things that we can do is help people and prevent them from being victims of any crime.
Right.
But specifically something like this, because this is really something, a very serious crime that occurs and it can have serious complications throughout your life.
Yeah,
so.
And we've seen a lot of success through prevention.
That's awesome.
It's a slower process. We have a lot of residents in Miami-Dade County, and our goal is to be able to engage with as many of them as possible. And so through means like this podcast and other social media and television and radio, our goal is to be able to continue to just share the information. And again, even if we just stir the conversation.
We talked, you mentioned about how it's a busy time. It's always happening. But tell me, what's so special about this month? What's going on when it comes to human trafficking?
So January is Human Trafficking and Awareness Month. Okay. So similar to other awareness months, it's really a time where a lot of the community organizations, law enforcement, multidisciplinary groups like the task force come together and are trying to maximize awareness on human trafficking through events, through trainings, through just different ways that the community has found to really engage with everyone and bring awareness on human trafficking. So it's a very busy month for us. A lot of requests for us to provide trainings and bring and attend outreaches and awareness events to really. People always like to know the perspective of what is Miami-Dade Police Department doing on this issue. So we get invited quite often to these conversations. And again, our task force has been around for so long that we also get the invitation from that perspective of that multidisciplinary. How do we combine all these pieces together to really be successful in what we're doing? And we ourselves are hosting an event, this month, as we always try to. And we're actually taking a different approach than I think some other partners really do. We're tapping into hosting our 3rd annual Interfaith Leaders Training. And so we do that because we have found and have heard from different cases and victims that we've had the privilege to work with that say that, oddly enough, sometimes attending church is really the only thing the trafficker allows them to do. And so why not make sure that the churches and the faith-based leaders are trained and aware on what
to look for. They're just like our schools. If they're going to school, it's a good place for them to learn some red flags. And now here in church,
So this is our third year hosting this, where we invite all denominations to come. We start with the leaders because we've learned if we can get the leaders on board, then really it's a trickling effect to get the rest of the interfaith organization on board, and really training them and educating them on what human trafficking is, but more importantly, what can they do as an interfaith organization. We get a lot of requests often of the interfaith organizations wanting to get involved, and so we've created a space for them to be able to do that. And this is really going to be gearing up for our event in February, where we work with the migrant community down in the Homestead area to provide prevention to them. As we were talking about, they're a vulnerable group that oftentimes don't know they have these resources available. So we are going into the community and engaging with them and training them in a more practical way of conversation of what human trafficking is, and really see if there's anyone that identifies as a victim and connect them immediately with services.
It's all about awareness, I always say. So that's awesome. Looks like you guys have a busy month or two ahead of you guys when it comes to that, but we appreciate everything you do and everything that you've done. So lastly, as we wrap it up here, how can Citizens Crime Watch help you guys?
Yeah.
How can we help when it comes to human trafficking? I know you already talked about a little bit about being the eyes and ears, but what can we do to help you guys?
Really emphasizing being the eyes and ears to support the efforts, right, from the police department and the investigations and reporting. Tips and leads are very important for the work that we do. That's really where we get the information. I think you made the comment earlier that, you know, an officer could drive through a community, but if they don't know the community, they probably wouldn't think that something's taking place. But so those tips and leads really are crucial for our human trafficking group and the department to take action as they need to. But also join these different working groups that exist. The South Florida Human Trafficking Task Force. We have a lot of coalitions, the Miami-Dade County Coalition Against Human Trafficking and Broward Human Trafficking Coalition. There's a ton of groups that are coming together where citizens of the different communities can come and be a part of it, and they can be representative of this group and take the information that they're gathering and educate the rest of the group and letting them know, hey, it's prevalent, it's happening. These are the trends that they're telling us is happening. This is the information that they're seeing. And again, expanding, being the eyes and ears of our community. And
staying current, because, you know, like any crimes change. So there may be some new tactics that come up or some new red flags that come up. So staying aware, staying in the know. So again, you know, what you guys can do and what's most important is if you see something, say something. I know that's a term that's very popular, but again, it's better to report something and it be nothing than cases like we've talked about where something happens and then later on you go, you know, that was a little bit strange and we maybe could have prevented it or intervened a little bit earlier. So, but for all of our listeners out there and all of our viewers, stay involved. Don't pass the buck to somebody else to think, hey, somebody else will report this. Just take the time. It's always better that it turns out to be nothing. Yeah. But, okay, so again, thanks again, Caridad, for coming out. We truly appreciate everything you do, everything that the task force does. It sounds like a lot of work, so I'm sure it's tiresome, but I'm sure it's rewarding as well when you're able to help some of these victims and intervene and stop some of these criminals, these traffickers from doing what they're doing. So thank you for all that you do. Thank you for all that the task force does. And on behalf of Citizens Crime Watch, you can count on us to be partners with you in combating this very serious crime and trying to make lives better for some people here in Miami-Dade County.
Well, thank you. And thank you for using your platform as an opportunity to engage in this conversation. And again, if anybody, you know, listens to this episode and thinks that they may know someone or they think they may be a victim of human trafficking, as we've mentioned throughout this podcast, there are supportive services, and law enforcement is ready and aware of how to handle these particular cases.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a great day.
You too.
So make sure you stay tuned for a future podcast. We're going to be tackling this topic again because human trafficking is so important. We will have some future guests from our state attorney's office to talk about their efforts when it comes to human trafficking. So make sure you keep listening, you keep watching. Remember, see something, say something. And what I always say, crime prevention starts with you.